We will now begin our first presentation titled The Nature of Conscious Awareness, Neuroscience, Meditation, and Near-Death Experiences. This presentation will be delivered remotely by Dr. Marjorie Wallacott, Emeritus Professor of Neuroscience at the University of Oregon and President of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. Dr. Wallacott is also the Research Director for the International Association of Near-Death Studies. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. I want to thank the Tzu Chi Foundation for organizing this wonderful event. I've titled my presentation, as you heard, The Nature of Consciousness, Conscious Awareness. I've titled my presentation, The Nature of Conscious Awareness, Neuroscience, Meditation, and Near-Death Experiences, because I believe these areas of research are key to our ability to penetrate the mysteries of the apparent world. And the two books shown on the right of the slide remind you that I'll be wearing two hats today, and that of a neuroscientist who wrote the textbook Motor Control, Translating Research into Clinical Practice, as well as a meditator who wrote the book Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of the Scientific Mind. And here is an overview of the topics I'll be covering today. I'll first tell you about my background as a neuroscientist and the transformation of my worldview with my first meditation experience, so you can see how this began to open me to a curiosity about the real nature of consciousness. And then we'll be asking, what is consciousness? And examining the neural filters in the brain that severely limit awareness of the world around us. And then we'll relate these findings to teachings of ancient texts from Kashmir and Tibet, and talk about how we can reduce those filters by actually expanding our awareness through meditation and near-death experiences. So let me give you some background about myself. I am a neuroscientist. In the lab, I have typically studied behavior from what I call the third-person perspective, that is, objectively. And I've written about 200 papers in neuroscience. I've received grants from the National Institutes of Health in the United States for 35 years, and I was a scientific materialist when I started my research. And my scientific view was that the material world is the sole basis of reality. Thus, our thoughts, our movements, and our awareness or our consciousness are solely a product of the neurons in our brain. Then, in 1976, I began to meditate, and I had an experience in meditation that opened up for me an awareness of a dimension of reality I had never before experienced. I was invited by my sister to a meditation retreat given by an Indian meditation master. And though I was skeptical, I was curious and I decided to attend. The first morning of the retreat, it was announced that during the meditation session, the Swami would initiate every individual there. The initiation was described as a spiritual awakening, and it was to happen through the Swami's touch. Obviously, the scientist in me was skeptical. Since I was there, however, I decided to put my skepticism aside for the weekend. Besides, I was curious to see what would happen. When he reached me, I felt the Swami's thumb and fingers right between my eyes and on the bridge of my nose. And it seemed like a tiny lightning bolt leapt from his fingers to a point between my eyes and down to the center of my chest. I could feel the exact point where the energy stopped, right at the area of my heart. The energy that came from my heart radiated outward, filling my whole being and beyond. It felt like nectar, like pure love pouring through me. Words came to mind, and they had nothing to do with scientific analysis. I'm home. I'm home. My heart is my home. What was most astonishing was what happened afterwards. Without my effort or even willing it, I made a 180-degree shift in my habits beginning the morning after I returned home. I got up at 5 a.m. spontaneously and I meditated. I did this knowing that just beneath the surface of my awareness simmered a quiet ecstasy. I tapped it once and I felt it was there waiting for me. There was a shift in my worldview, as you see in the slide, and I asked, is consciousness tied to neural activity, or could consciousness exist without neurons? I began to ask, what is consciousness? I questioned the authenticity or completeness of my materialist worldview. Could it be that my lens had been similar to the limited awareness one might have when viewing this picture you see, only observing a vase, because one's awareness is only focused on the black foreground and misses the faces that are also present in the background? I began to explore the premises of materialism versus consciousness being fundamental to reality. I'll now show you two alternative brain-consciousness interface models. In this slide is the materialist or physicalist model of reality, which is the one I had as a young neuroscientist, that consciousness or the mind is solely a product of brain activity, though it is not understood how this might occur. This is indicated by the drawing of that material brain and the arrows going upward to create mental activity and the mind's contents, which is that deep blue crescent. However, it's still not understood how this might occur, as I've indicated by that big red question mark, and this is called the hard problem by neuroscientists. This next slide shows that second model that we often call idealism. It's a model proposed by the physicist Federico Fagin, the scientist Bernardo Kastrup, myself, and others. As you see in the slide, consciousness is considered fundamental to reality. What is its nature? It is a creative, unified field with free will, and it gives purpose, meaning, and direction to the universe. And importantly, it wants to know itself. And now if we go to the green box that's right below the top blue box, in the process of knowing itself, it creates consciousness units, the parts whole of the one, as you see on the slide, illustrated by all those small points of consciousness in yellow, which then become embodied and are represented by the figures of individuals below them. Now, these consciousness units, including the points of consciousness that become humans, have both the experience of interiority, that is their awareness, and when embodied, what it's like to be a person, and exteriority, what they experience as objectivity outside their own awareness, that is the other consciousness units of the universe. And as a result of this apparent process of separation, they become ignorant of their essential unified nature. In the lower part of the slide, I diagram the mind, again in deep blue, and the brain, and show the mind-brain filters on the lower right-hand corner that vastly reduce our awareness of non-local consciousness through the senses and the higher brain networks such as the language centers and the default mode network, etc. And now note that I also have arrows going in both directions from the brain up through the mind and consciousness, because I believe it descends from non-local consciousness down to the mind and brain and ascends also up to non-local consciousness, as I believe that experience can be shared between our individual and our non-local consciousness. And now in this diagram I focus on the individual points of consciousness that are created when that infinite awareness desires to know itself. So as it becomes individual points of consciousness, it forgets its infinite interconnectivity. And in the diagram, I show a human, a tree, a cat, and a bird, etc., as these individual points of consciousness, with both the interiority or subjectivity, being aware what it feels like to be a human, and possibly also self-reflection that you see here, this yellow arrow going back to infinite awareness, glimpsing one's own nature. And then I show objectivity as the person is looking out across what I might call the dissociative barrier to see what appear to be trees and cats and birds and humans, etc. And most importantly, I propose that this illusion actually occurs due to the filtering process of the mind and the brain, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. So these filters we encounter in our perception are the first filters are the sensory receptors themselves. And as you see in the slide, the sensory receptors canalize and restrict our perception of the vibratory information that exists all around us. I give you one example in the slide, That's the pigments in the visual receptors, which only pick up 3 ranges of the wavelengths of the whole vibratory spectrum. As you see, they're blue, green, and yellow. And that same point is true for all of the 5 senses. Research has also shown that our normal waking state is highly influenced by the default mode or mind-wandering network of the brain, considered to be the source of the ego. It creates the narratives we tell about ourselves and others throughout our day, as well as our identification with our thoughts, our emotions, and the roles we play in the world. And I want to focus on 2 nodes. The first is the medial prefrontal cortex right in the front of the head, and the second is the posterior cingulate cortex toward the back of the head. This is a slide of a brain scan during normal background thought processes, and it is lit up in bright red, showing the high levels of activity. The default mode network's main influence is to filter out a broader perceptual awareness so that we experience only a small trickle of the information that's available from the universe. And during our day-to-day living, this network is very active. Now, in addition to the filtering of this default mode network, the left hemisphere networks involving logic, as you see in the slide, analysis, sequencing, linear processing, mathematics, and language, etc., are another brain conceptual filter that's very important. And the figure shows these linear quantitative aspects of left brain function compared to the more holistic perceptions of the right brain, as you see on the right-hand side of the slide, such as creativity, imagination, holistic thinking, and intuition. And Ian McGilchrist proposes that in our mechanistic age, the left brain is dominant, and thus more holistic perceptions of reality are diminished. And in fact, our left hemisphere language centers have been described as a filter of perception, focusing our attention on particular aspects of the world. The neuroanatomist Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, whose photo you see in the slide, describes her state after experiencing a stroke to the left side of the brain in which she lost her language centers. She says, I shifted from the doing consciousness of my left brain to the being consciousness of my right brain, from feeling small and isolated to feeling enormous and expansive. She says that immediately after the stroke, she had lost many of her brain's perceptual filters and thus felt that light was uncomfortable and sound blasted her brain senseless. Now, the last filters on our list are the thalamus in the midbrain and the thalamocortical loop, which control the parts of the world we attend to. As you see on the left-hand side of the slide, the thalamus, which is in brown and white in the midbrain, would get overwhelmed with information if it allowed all this information to be passed on to our executive attention system in our prefrontal cortex, labeled here PFC. And so what happens, as you see on the right, is when we only want to listen to one sense, like in this case, our hearing, what happens is our prefrontal cortex activates the basal ganglia and the thalamic reticular nucleus to inhibit, in this case, the visual stimulus is coming in to the midbrain, so that now we can focus only on auditory inputs and thus focus on that one part of the environment that is actually most important to us. Another one of the ways that the thalamus takes this filtering even further is through the reverberating thalamocortical loop. In the bottom right-hand figure, you see the circuitry of this loop going from the various areas of the cortex, shown in a variety of colors, onto the thalamus and then returning back to the cortex. Thus, this creates a potentially closed system, with the input to the thalamus from the cerebral cortex being larger than that from the sensory systems. This means that under normal conditions, brain inputs from our current thoughts can be more powerful than inputs from the world around us in creating our perception of reality. So with all this in mind, what I want to do now is look at the research on changes in perception and activity of these filters under conditions that produce mystical experiences. And I think you will see that this research shows a decrease in that filtering process associated with the sense of expanded awareness. We'll start with meditation. I'm going to give you a case study and then show research on what is occurring in the brain. So Dr. Athena Potari, who I interviewed for a study, received her PhD from Oxford University and is a fellow at Harvard University. And I think her experience as a description of the dissociative barriers or boundaries between ourselves and a wider awareness dissolving during the meditation experience is really apt for what we're talking about in removing those barriers to this awareness. She said, "After a while, I cannot recall duration. It was like I cracked open from the center of my heart and everything opened up. Everything was one. There was no I. Living consciousness revealed itself as all. Matter is consciousness. Space is consciousness. Everything is one spirit playing the role of you and me, of it and them, of here and there, in a vast dimensionless eternity, which our mind divides into time." This experience transformed Dr. Potari's life. Her colleagues at the university were approaching consciousness at purely an intellectual level, leaving out the lived aspect, which she felt was essential. She wanted to share with everyone that philosophy can be approached experientially. So she created a school in Athens and is now teaching others from this new perspective. So this is a case study from research on deep meditation experiences. What do we believe is happening in the brain at this time? Interestingly, during these deep experiences of meditation, there are significant reductions in this key brain network, the default mode network, which you saw previously. Dr. Judson Brewer of Yale University asked if there are changes in this default mode network in long-term meditators which might explain their expanded experiences. He made brain scans in advanced meditators versus control participants who were new to meditation as they meditated. The right figure shows significant reductions in the default mode network activity during mystical states of meditation over here. And it shows us that the brain actually becomes quite still as the narrative part of our brain is silenced. What you see is that basically the prefrontal cortex and also the posterior cingulate cortex both are now colored blue instead of red. And in the graph below, you see the drop in activity in these areas in meditators compared to in control subjects. So the important point is at the same time this happens, our limited separate self begins to feel like there is a decrease in those egoic boundaries, and we become more porous to this expanded awareness. So this is not what one would expect from a materialist model, which predicts that reducing brain activity would result in a less enriched experience, and we find just the opposite. Another question we might ask is what happens in meditation when one moves truly toward deeply mystical unity awareness? This is a study by Schoenberg and colleagues examining more advanced studies of meditation in practitioners of Indo-Tibetan essence of mind Buddhism. It explored changes in their neural activation during progressively deeper states of meditative absorption. And the ultimate aim is to experience a non-dual state of awakened awareness and compassion. And as you see on the slide, this is achieved by progressing through these following states that you see on the bottom of the slide. First, we have baseline awareness, and then we go to the experience of timelessness. Next is emptiness, non-duality, and non-conceptuality. Then luminosity experience. And finally, there is stabilized, non-localized, brilliantly awake awareness. Now, here is what they found in the graph. Between baseline and the first phase of meditation that you see on this part of the graph, there is a shift towards this more effortless state associated with this reduction in brain energy. And that really means there's reduced gamma current density and decreased default mode network activity. Then, as they move into deeper states, there is a slight progressive increase in brain energy. And they believe this is because the attainment of each state engages more complex executive attention and active alertness, and that culminates in the state described as brilliantly awake. Next, what we're going to be doing is looking at near-death experiences, and we'll be asking, can consciousness remain when the heart and the brain have stopped functioning? And are NDEs real, or are they hallucinations? And let me first relate the case study of Dr. Bettina Payton. Dr. Payton was an avowed materialist until she had a near-death experience during the birth of her third child, which was by cesarean section. Payton lost consciousness under anesthesia until she heard a voice. Her blood pressure is too low. She says, my anesthesiologist's alarmed voice had snapped me awake as if from a deep sleep. And at the same time, my vision opened, and I discovered that I could see into the room. How amazing! My eyelids had been taped shut to protect the corneas. Yet by some other mechanism, I could see perfectly clearly. Then there was a volley of strident beats, the cardiac monitor indicating her heart had stopped. And Payton watched the anesthesiologist slam his fist into a large red button in the wall, calling a code, culminating in the arrival of the resuscitation team. But let's now look at another aspect of Payton's experience. She says, I saw in my inner vision a vast darkness expanding behind me. My awareness reached the edge of the precipice, and I leaned backward. Very naturally, I let myself fall, gliding downward in a graceful backward arc into the unknown. The blackness sparkled, it shimmered. She sensed a pervasive presence in this light, an intelligence, a pervasive pulsating power. All was perfect until her experience was interrupted by the statement, you must live. Funneling down through the darkness, her consciousness opened into that hospital operating room. The members of the code team burst through the swinging doors and saw their colleague's lifeless body on the table. She says, my attention was drawn to a white-haired gentleman, a senior surgeon, entering the room. Slowly and deliberately, he wove a path through the room, coming to my right side. Without a word, he reached deep into my blood-filled abdomen, located the aorta, and then wrapped his fingers around it, clamping the aorta shut. Shortly afterwards, one of the doctors whispered into Payton's ear that the baby had lived. She had a healthy daughter. When Payton later opened her eyes, she was in the critical care unit, lying in a bed encircled by the team of doctors and nurses. She still had a tube in her trachea, so she couldn't talk, but she put up her hand to keep people from speaking and motioned to be given something to write with. Before anyone spoke, Payton had written, I know I have a baby girl. I know my uterus is out. I know my heart stopped. Payton said, when I woke up in the intensive care unit, I had vivid recall of what had happened. My perception was, as it still is, that I am not this body, this individual, and that consciousness is the substratum of everything that exists. And she went on to work in hospice care. People said that when she walked into a hospice room, her lack of fear of death could be felt. So let's now review the research on NDEs in peer-reviewed journals. I will specifically focus on one study by Pim van Lommel in The Lancet, ranked number 2 of 150 journals in medicine. There were 344 patients in the study with cardiac arrest. They had flat EEG, that is, no brain activity during their cardiac arrest. 12% had a core NDE, and 1/4 watched and recalled verified events during cardiac arrest with no brain activity. Pim van Lommel concludes at the end of this peer-reviewed article, the thus far assumed but never proven concept that consciousness and memories are localized in the brain should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death with flat EEG? Interestingly, it has now been shown that persons who did not remember their NDE after cardiac arrest, they actually can undergo hypnosis, and the hypnosis may induce memory recall. And in fact, I recently wrote an article on that topic. So what models can explain this research relating the experiences in deep meditation and NDEs? I think this model can explain what happens when we go from normal waking consciousness to an experience of expanded awareness, and one of these experiences of meditation or an NDE. So in normal waking awareness, as you see on the left-hand side of the slide, our capacity to experience non-local or cosmic consciousness is reduced in the presence of this normal brain function. And so we have lots of thoughts going on in our narrative mind, and we have a large default mode network. The default mode network then creates these stories which keep us from experiencing wider awareness. But when we have a deep meditation experience or an NDE, what happens is that default mode network is reduced or eliminated, and now this green arrow shows the vast amount of information coming from non-local consciousness that now can come into our perceptual awareness. So what is the significance of these studies? In meditation and NDEs, we see correlations between reduced brain activity and increased access to non-local experience and perceptions. In NDEs, the individual perceives information from a perspective which is outside their body, which cannot occur through the five senses. And these events are life-transforming in most of the persons who experience them. Now, in the last part of my discussion, I want to turn to a text from Kashmir Shaivism and bring us full circle to what has been discussed in ancient traditions well before we began studying the neural filters of the brain. And I want to note that I think I actually have 5 more minutes because we started about 5 minutes late, so I will be just having this last 5 minutes of my talk. So the Ishwara Pratyabhijnakarika by Utpaladeva presents a non-dual framework for reality and examines the role of the mind, language, and conceptuality in creating our experience of reality. His core thesis is, there is one innate self that comprises the essential nature of all beings, and this consciousness is all-pervasive. Though this consciousness is innate to all beings, it conceals itself in manifesting the world. This process involves freely assuming the limitations of space-time and the structure of cause and effect. In this way, consciousness unfurls a universe populated by countless subjects and environments of experience, which all ultimately shine within and as that consciousness. The challenge is that if all beings are in fact universal consciousness, why don't they experience themselves in such terms? In response, Utpaladeva presents an account of ignorance, which explains how the infinite agency of consciousness becomes exclusively identified with an individual self. He says consciousness freely identifies with those realities of our individual mind, our breath, and our body, which effectively contracts the scope of identity to our particular individual domain of experience. The key step in the process of all-pervasive consciousness delineating itself as a particularized locus of awareness is the power of conceptualization, which we talked about at the beginning of our talk. We assign linguistic designations to phenomena, conceptually carving out objects such as a bird or a tree or a cat. Importantly, this all corresponds to the crystallization of our limited identity. So in summary, this dualistic plane of our perception is grounded in our thoughts or our conceptuality because the concept of our own identity or any object in the field of our awareness actively carves out a particular reality through a process of excluding all else that's different. This act of an all-pervasive consciousness excluding its own vastness in order to give rise to a particular experience of an object can also be understood as a process of filtering, and it was used in the original texts. Thus, I believe we've come full circle in this 10th century text from Kashmir in again identifying the filtering process of the mind-brain as the source of limited awareness and our sense that the universe is separate from our essential self. And now I want to close with a quote by neuroscientist Christoph Koch, who for many years was a materialist and worked to prove that consciousness is purely a product of brain activity. He has recently modified his view to say that consciousness is distinct from brain activity. In fact, an idealist or point of view that consciousness is fundamental. He says, the hypothesis that all matter is sentient to some degree is terribly appealing for its elegance, its simplicity, and its logical coherence. Once you assume that consciousness is real and ontologically distinct from its physical substrate, then it is a simple step to conclude that the entire cosmos is suffused with sentience. It is in the air we breathe, the soil we tread on, and the brain that enables us to think. These are revolutionary statements from one who was a materialist neuroscientist, a Caltech professor, and a research colleague of Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize winner. Thank you very much for your attention.